defects management could easily be repeated for this webinar, but I'm going to try and avoid that and focus more on kind of object-specific concepts. So I do encourage you to check out the webinar archive on CCAHA's website, which is ccaaha.org. All right, sounds like we have some taxidermy, musical instruments. Okay, all right, let's see what we can do. Okay. So as I'm sure you're aware, the environment is very important for the longevity of collections, and that definitely includes objects. So if your conditions are uncontrolled and unmonitored, damage can sneak up on you. You'll often see 50% relative humidity and 70 degrees Fahrenheit recommended for mixed collections. That is a good rule of thumb, but just so you're aware, in a mixed collection, there's really no way to please everything. Probably nothing is at its ideal environment, but those moderate conditions are the best overlapping windows that we have for so many different needs. So as an example of what I mean, on screen I have this bronze on the left and then a mammoth molar on the right. And metals, especially if they're not, as long as they're not composite with another material, are best stored in dry conditions. Pretty much the drier the better. But on the other hand, this mammoth molar was exposed to low relative humidity, and that resulted in quite a lot of damage. I don't know how well it shows up in the images, but existing cracks widened, new cracks formed, and you won't be able to see it in this image, but pieces just started falling off. And that's after only one cycle. So if you have these two objects in the same storage space, you will have to make a compromise, and that's why stable and moderate is your best bet. Fluctuations are probably the most damaging, so it's important to monitor your conditions and do what you can to soften those variations. And as soon as you get into composite objects, especially those with tension, like musical, like stringed instruments, it can seem like, what can you possibly do? So stable and moderate. In this particular instance with the bronze and the molar, one option would be to use a microenvironment, maybe use a moisture scavenger for the bronze to bring the relative humidity down just locally around that object. I hadn't really intended to go into scavengers very much, but if that's something that people are interested in, we can definitely revisit that at the end. So other parts of the environment include air quality and light. Those have been covered in previous webinars, so I'm not going to go into it too much, but just so you know, if you're looking for material-specific environmental recommendations, you can try the CCI Notes series, that's the Canadian Conservation Institute, and also the National Park Service Museum Handbook. Those are a couple of my go-tos. The appendices of Part 1 of the Museum Handbook goes into quite a lot of detail for a number of different material types. You'll find under Files on screen, there's a Care of Objects links document, and that includes links to both the Notes series and the Museum Handbook. So handling is another area where there's quite a lot of overlap. So definitely check out, like care of paper, that's a good one. There is one consideration that I'd like to highlight here just because I think it might come up a little bit more often with objects. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's handling restrictions and for reasons other than poor condition. So handling restrictions can apply to collections for your own safety or also out of cultural respect. Natural history collections and organics in human history collections often have pesticide residues on them depending on when they were collected and where they've been since then. Some collections are also just like inherently hazardous, lead or radioactive collections. So whatever system your institution uses to track hazardous collections, and if you don't have one, you might want to develop one. Make sure to check before handling so that you can take the appropriate safety precautions. You may need to wear gloves for a material that you wouldn't otherwise. You might want to wear a mask, an apron, and so forth. So On screen, we have this oyster catcher taxidermy specimen that tested positive for, I think it was arsenic, and that's indicated by that eye-catching pink skull and crossbones tag. So if you see something like that, definitely investigate farther before just jumping right in there. Let's see. You also want to make yourself aware of any cultural protocols before handling objects. So if an object is from a culture that you're not familiar with, you're not sure what the object is or its cultural significance, you might just want to double check because some objects do have restrictions. So once you get to the actual handling, as with other collections, of course you want to be sure to adequately support the object. And I generally just assume, like unless I know otherwise, that an object is like a baby, that it just can't hold up any of its own parts. So many objects have very tempting handles, and in use, they were designed to be handled, which is why they're called handles. But in collections, those are usually weak points and they should be avoided for handling. So this illustration shows a suitcase with a very nice enticing handle at the top. But if I carry this suitcase by the handle and I lose control of the object, my hands have to travel, like the whole height of the suitcase plus a distance that it falls in that time. So unless, I guess I could yank on the handle, but that will probably break it. And that's also assuming that the handle breaking is not the reason it's falling in the first place. So compared to the right, supporting the suitcase from below, if I lose control of the suitcase now, I'm just much more likely to recover the object because my hands are just right there. Basically, you just want to consider your hand placement, minimize your chance of breaking the object, and maximize your chances of recovering the object if you do lose control. And that's just generally usually underneath. So that brings me to this kind of sad truth, and that is that objects do get damaged, and handling is one of the most common ways. And that's why it's so important to go through that mental checklist from before. Do I actually need to handle this object, and am I equipped to do so? But even with all of that preparation, it still does happen. So I've handled a lot of objects, and I have broken an object. I knocked an object over. It fell onto the floor. And even though I was trained in object handling, I have to say my first instinct was like get on the floor and try and sweep it up. But fortunately, my training kicked in before I did that. And as distressing as it was for me for that object to be on the floor, when I took that moment to assess the situation, it became clear that it wasn't in any immediate further danger. I was behind the scenes. I wasn't out in a public gallery. I didn't have to worry about visitors stepping on the object or, taking pieces or anything like that. There were no liquid components that might seep or spill. There were no kind of squishy components that might permanently deform by being on the floor. Basically, the damage had happened. It had already happened, and it wasn't going to continue immediately. So once I took that step back and assessed the situation, I actually realized that I had the luxury of documentation. So I went and I told my coworkers what had happened to just let them know and get help, and also to help calm me down because I was freaking out. Conservation wasn't available that day, so what we did is put caution tape around the object, and I just started documenting. I made annotated sketches. I took photographs, both kind of overview of the scene as well as detail photographs, and I came up with a temporary numbering system to collect the pieces so that it was clear, where this physical piece was in the images. When we were able to take it to conservation later, the conservator was able to use all of that documentation for a much more efficient treatment. So it's really important, even for small incidents, to document. It's not just useful for conservation, it can also be really important for insurance claims. And, like it or not, it does become part of the object's interpretation for the rest of its life. You might have an object in your collection that is there because a famous person or someone really important to your institution's mission had it, and maybe they broke it, and that would be something that you might want to preserve. But the only way to tell the difference between that kind of historic significance damage and, kind of your damage is to document it. And if you think about objects in your collections that have damage, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but personally, I would rather know what happened than have to guess. So one way to reduce the chances of breaking an object during handling is to provide a storage support that can be handled instead of the object. So supports also benefit an object by protecting it from light, pollutants, and those fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity that we discussed. Good support also provides cushioning and supports all of those various parts that I mentioned may or may not be able to support themselves. And there was already some information on materials for supports given in previous webinars, so I'm going to kind of skim over that a little bit, but just be aware that objects do have mostly similar sensitivities. Most objects are sensitive to acids, and those will be eliminated through the photographic activity test. Regarding buffered versus unbuffered paper, both leather and metals are in the unbuffered column, just so that you're aware. And a lot of objects also off-gas themselves, so that's also something to be aware of. So once you feel comfortable with the chemical compatibility of your materials, the rest of material selection for supports is makes a lot of sense. Right? Is it the right texture? Is it strong enough? And is it cost effective, which is usually a factor. So when you're selecting a support or designing custom support, it's also really important to remember access. The image on screen is a birch bark wallet, and when it came in, it was stored in this plastic bag, and there was a specific request from the client not to increase the storage footprint because the space, storage space was very tight, which I'm sure is a situation most of us are pretty familiar with. They didn't want like a big padded box that was going to add an inch on every side. They wanted to be able to put it back from the spot that they pulled it from. But because the bag is so close in size to the actual object, every time that the wallet had to come out or go back into the bag, that zip mechanism would catch and abrade the delicate surface. So all we did was add this little tray. It's folder weight, acid-free, lignin-free paper sewn onto a piece of mat board. The mat board is for pulling on, and then the tray just keeps the bag open enough as you're pulling that the zip doesn't contact the wallet. So this is an example of a way that we were able to maintain the visual access through the bag, keep the small footprint that was really important to the client, and also reduce that physical risk. So what I've done for this next section is just put together a few slides that highlight different common styles of supports, specifically the ones that allow you to handle the support rather than the object. So that's trays, pallets, and boxes. After that, I have a couple of slides of just other storage solutions that we can talk through, and then some general support building tips. If this is an area that people are particularly interested in, I have a few kind of extra slides at the end, like after the end of the presentation, about setting up a functional support building workspace. If that's something you're interested in, let me know and we can kind of visit it after the main section. Almost all of the images in this section show supports that are made out of blue board. You might know it as gray board. It's basically just high quality corrugated cardboard. You can also make these out of coroplast, which is a fluted plastic sheet, or if you have really light objects, paper, you can just scale them up or down depending on the strength that you need. I do also just want to mention that this section might be either overwhelming or underwhelming, depending on your experience with collection housing. So I do encourage you to ask questions as we go just to get the most out of it. And please don't be embarrassed to ask questions for clarification. Support building requires a lot of spatial reasoning, and I find it difficult to communicate some of the concepts in this format where you can't see like my wild hand gestures. So if you don't understand, it is probably me. It is not you. So just let me know. So trays, exactly what they sound like. They have a flat bottom and short sides, and they create a natural buffer zone around the object. I think a lot of people assume that building individual supports for every object will take up more space. And in some cases it does, like if you have baskets stacked inside each other, and then when you go to rehouse them, you have to unstack them to house them properly. And in that case, you would increase your storage footprint. But In my experience, I found that it's more often the opposite. If you have a lot of objects that are in a drawer, you don't want to put them too close to each other because they can walk around when the drawer is open and closed. So you're leaving kind of walking around space between every object. But if they all have their own support, if they all have trays, you can put them pretty much wall to wall without worrying about them knocking into each other. They might bump into the side of their tray, which I'll address in a second, but they're not going to hit the sides of the drawer, and they're not going to hit their neighbors. So you might find that you can actually get objects closer together if you make supports for all of them. Another advantage of trays and boxes is that they catch fragments. So if you have objects that tend to lose bits, I'm looking at you, rock and mineral specimens, this keeps all the pieces together and also helps keep your storage furniture and linings clean. Trays are really good maximizers of material because they use a rectangular pattern. There's a kind of sample diagram there where very little gets discarded. So just to describe that, from the edge to the dotted line becomes the walls. So that's the height of your tray. Those corners become the tabs to tack the object, either to use like hot glue or to sew the tab in place to connect the walls, so none of that gets thrown out. One of the disadvantages of trays is that they don't offer any dust or light protection, so they're best used in drawers and cabinets. There's just more examples of trays. If a tray gets too small, it gets hard to construct and also to access. So if you have small objects or really skinny objects that would have at least one small dimension, you might think about combining them in one tray, and there's just a few ways to do that. On the left, there's a paper accordion. Those are nice for long, skinny objects, but you don't want to make them too tight because then you've made a spring, and you don't want that. So I like to anchor the accordion in the bottom. You can either do that with hot glue, with the objects out of the tray, of course, and then waiting for that to cool down before putting them back, or you can also use thread and tack those down. You don't have to do every trough, just enough to keep the accordion from popping out. So on the right, there's a tray and pallet combination to provide access for an icon with fragile edges. The tray helps protect the edges, but it also means it's hard to get your fingers in there. So the icon sits on a pallet with two side tabs, and those slot into the corresponding kind of gaps in the tray wall so that you can just lift straight up. When I first started making trays, they seemed really simple, so I didn't think too much about it. But here are just a few traps that I fell into. So if you're just getting started making trays, here are just some things to keep in mind. For example, I would try to use the least amount of material and make the smallest tray. But for objects like this cup and many other shapes that are smaller at the base, you can make a tiny tray and the object will go in, but that destroys the buffer zone that I was talking about before. And when you actually go to put these objects on the shelf, they can hit each other. As opposed to on the right, where if you find the widest dimension and accommodate that, then you have maintained that buffer zone. Trays are short, so if you have tall objects, first you might want to reconsider the tray option, but for baskets which are really light, it can still be a good option, but it's best to add bumpers to keep them from tipping out. So that's what's shown on the right here, a whole bunch of baskets with bumpers. The third point about annotating your support, it's really easy to see how the object fits into a support when you're the one making it and as you're making it. But you should be thinking about when someone removes the object, for research or for exhibition, how apparent is it how that object goes back into the support? If it's not very, then you should include notes. And that can be something as simple as writing front, where the front of the object goes, if the object has a front. Or it could be like full instructions, if it's a really complicated support, how to undo and redo it. You just want to be able to make sure that it's usable and think about how that object is going to be accessed in the future. So pallets are just like trays without sides, so naturally this offers less physical protection, but it also makes it a very customizable footprint. You can make trays in other shapes, but it's a pain, so it's just easier to do with a pallet. The other thing is that the sides of a tray make it a lot sturdier. Not just at the sides, but also at the base, kind of locks the base in place and keeps it from twisting or bending. So pallets don't have that, so they're not great for like heavy or tall objects. And like trays, they're not ideal for open storage because they are also really open. A few examples of pallets. Because there's no walls, you will have to find some way to keep the object from sliding off. Bumpers are really great for immobilizing kind of wiggly parts. I'll actually just go back a slide. The image on the bottom, you can see there's a cord, but both kind of rigid pieces are held in place with bumpers. Okay. You can also use tie downs or even just a bag as shown for this bracelet, the green bracelet in the middle of the slide. If objects are light enough, you can put multiple objects on a pallet like these model snowshoes. Another option is to combine a tray and a pallet to make a tiered tray. So along the bottom of the slide, there are these two objects. One is placed in the bottom of a tray with extra tall bumpers so that the second object can sit on a pallet on top without touching the object below, and the second object has tie downs. With multiple objects on one support like this, whether it's the snowshoe model or this kind of bunk bed configuration, you do have to consider association. It might not be appropriate for some objects to share a support, but in this case, these were sets, so we weren't worried about that in this case. If you're just getting started with pallets, here's a few tips. Again, like trays, if you want the pallet to provide a no-fly zone, you do have to make it larger than the object. It seems obvious, but be surprised. And it also works best if the board is flat. You're relying on the thickness of the board to provide that buffer zone. So you might have some bowed or warped blue board, and you can still use that for trays and boxes, but I don't really recommend it for pallets because that means that there's gaps under the pallet and another pallet can slide in there and then your objects can touch. So in the photo on the right, hopefully you can see that there's a pallet coming in from the bottom that has kind of jumped the curb of the pallet next to it. So it's actually on top of the neighboring pallet. In this case, the edge of the pallet has run into a bumper that you can't see underneath the spoon that keeps it from moving any further, but in general, you're trying to avoid this overlapping pallet situation. But the reason that I included this picture was actually for a good reason, and that was to show you how many more spoons we could fit in this drawer by having the customizable footprint compared to if we had done rectangular trays. So tapered shapes like this can gain a lot of space using pallets. And of course, round shapes like spoons gain a lot of stability from having a support. As you can imagine, like opening a drawer of spoons, unsupported spoons, and they're all wiggling, as opposed to if they have these supports. If you want to use tie downs but tool tape is too abrasive, there are ways around that. You could just switch material to something like strips of Tyvek. In the image on the left, it's white on white, so hopefully it shows up. But that's twill tape with a Volara foam sheath. Volara is a trade name. It's closed cell polyethylene foam sheet. It comes in different thicknesses, but if you can stock Volara, but you can only stock one thickness. I think that 1/8 inch is the most versatile. So this seat belt has a strip of Volara that's cut wider than the twill tape, and it has just 2 slits cut perpendicular to the long direction, and the twill tape runs through those, and that just keeps the Volara in place and between the object and the twill tape. You can, like if you're running short on time, you can also just put the piece of Volara underneath the twill tape, and the twill tape will hold it in place. But just in terms of if this object gets accessed a lot, Every time it gets untied and retied, the chances of that Volara strip just walking away gets higher and higher. So if it is an object that's accessed a lot, you might want to thread the twill tape through just to keep the Volara there. You can strengthen a pallet by using two sheets with the corrugations perpendicular to each other. That keeps it from bending and bowing. You can also upgrade to coroplast, which is just generally a stronger material than blueboard. So boxes, which I'm sure you are all already familiar with, they are just tall trays. So they have all the benefits of trays with the extra protection of the tall sides. They offer dust and light protection, especially if a lid is used. And on the flip side is that boxes generally reduce access, and they also, of course, use up more material. There's a few ways to get around the access issue. So on the left, there's a bowl in a box, and it's hard to access because of its height, unless you make the box a lot bigger, which takes up more shelf space, which we've already discussed. And also, even if you did get your fingers in there, you would still have to lift the bowl pretty high to clear the side of the box. So instead, one wall is can be untied from the rest of the box and then opened up like a drawbridge. There's a similar design in the Care of Photographs webinar. This bowl inside the box is on a pallet with a twill tape pull tab so that you can slide the pallet out onto the folded down side, and then you can access the bowl from all sides. I've also seen people do this where all four sides open like a flower. For me, like if I'm going the distance of making a box, I really like the stability that having three stationary sides offers, but of course it depends on your preference. The box in the middle has a Tyvek sling to just help begin the lifting process until you can get your hands underneath the object. This is a pretty quick solution, but it only works if the object can withstand a bit of tipping and if it isn't too heavy or too big. So it's kind of a small subset of objects that this works for, but it is a very simple solution when the object is suited for it. The image on the right deals with visual access. So the box has a Mylar window so that the object is visible in storage. And there's a trade-off there, I guess. You lose the light protection, but you also have visual access for things like pest monitoring. And as you can see in the picture, in this example, it is a natural history specimen. And so you just have to weigh out what you want out of your box. Again, for getting started with boxes, you want to start with the height first. That's the first measurement that you want because that dictates how far from the edge of the blue board you need to be. I've definitely done it before where I've started and then realized I didn't have enough blue board left for the walls. Just to kind of describe this diagram, the four arms of the kind of cross shape become the walls, and then the square in the middle is the bottom, and then the red kind of shaded areas get not discarded, but used for something else. They're not used for this box. And so another thing is if you're making a lid for a box, to trace the top, not the bottom, even though they're supposed to be the same dimension in theory, I found that just never happens. So, and labeling all of your supports should be labeled, but it's extra important for boxes because of that reduced visual access. So on the right, you have these boxes in the image that are on the top shelf. So you can't see inside unless you take the box down. So having identifying information on the outside just reduces the need for pulling them unnecessarily. And if possible, an image is also really helpful because some people would really rather browse visually than by number. So just think about who's going to be accessing the collection and how to accommodate that. So I just had a look around for some other kind of specialty supports, and some of them are shown here. The National Park Service has a whole conservagram dedicated to making saddle supports out of coroplast and Volara. So if you have saddles in your collection, you should check that out. There at the bottom, there's some hat supports I just found online. So there's a lot of storage solutions on the internet. So if you're feeling like you have storage building block, you can check some of those out. And then in the middle, there's a shoe support. And just a note about twill tape and blue board. I like to punch a hole in the blue board to run the twill tape through. But if you have something like this and the twill tape is sliding, you can just cut a notch in the blue board that the twill tape can just sit in, and that keeps it from sliding around so much. So those shoe supports, the diagram or kind of a sample diagram is on the right, and then a partially folded version is just underneath it. So I'm just going to give you guys a second with that diagram because it takes a while for that to make sense. And I'm just going to take a sip of water real quick. Okay, so moving away from supports that allow you to handle the support rather than the object, like away from individual supports, there are ways that you can still support an object without providing that. And because building a support for every object in your collection is a really big time commitment, and it takes a lot of materials, and as you know, quality materials are expensive, so there are still, you know, things that you can do. On the left, there's an insert, full drawer insert with bumpers, and it looks like an enormous pallet, but this isn't meant to be lifted. It's too big and too heavy. It just sits in the bottom of the drawer to give you something to attach all of those bumpers to. You can't move the objects individually without direct handling, but you can now open and close the drawer without the objects hitting each other. If you do move your objects around a lot from location to location, this might not be the option for you, but it's just an example. And there's a similar idea on the right, just kind of a pared back version. The whole drawer is lined with Volara, which I just recommend doing in general. Provide some cushioning for your objects. In this case, there are slits cut in the foam so that paper inserts can pass through, and there's kind of an illustration of that just above. And the paper just acts as separators for the halibut hooks to stop them from knocking into each other. And the sides of the drawer are lined with Volara too. So you're not totally stopping movement, but you're just preventing things from knocking into each other. Just a few more solutions. Backer rod rings, that's also a polyethylene foam, can help keep objects from tipping over. Snake weights are really, they're really flexible. They're good for kind of on-the-fly support, both in storage and in transport, like if you're wheeling something on a cart. You can also make your own, which is what's shown in the middle of the screen there. Sealed bags are helpful for isolation in a pinch, but also keep in mind that you're creating a microenvironment inside. So it's not necessarily a long-term storage solution if your objects are off-gassing, because all those volatiles will just get cooped up in there. Padded hangers are an option for robust garments, but that is something to take on a case-by-case basis. You know, it's kind of a trade-off. You have to have a pretty strong garment to be able to hang it, but at the same time, like the garment here with the lining, the fur collar, if you put that in a garment box, that fur will probably smash down over time. So it is a trade-off. And there is a conservagram on making padded hangers out of regular hangers, so it's not like you need to buy special hangers. You can make your own. Okay, this is the last slide for supports, if any of you are like not interested in supports. If you do need to build a lot of supports and you're trying to maximize your efficiency, I really recommend adding a couple of things to your toolkit beyond just like a ruler and a box cutter, and that is a drafting triangle and a Japanese screw punch. I love both of these things. Triangles are really handy for several things. In the bottom left corner, there, when you pair it with a ruler, it's nice for making really quick parallel lines without having to like measure twice and then line everything up. It's just kind of a shortcut. And then also how I mentioned you want to make your trays or pallets, any support, wider than the object. It can be difficult if it's a shape like this basket on screen or the cup. You know, you end up kind of like looking over it and trying to trace around it. But if you have a triangle, you can use that to just slide right up and it becomes very apparent how wide your object is. Just a note about ethafoam. So ethafoam is a like blocky polyethylene foam, and it's expensive. So most people, you know, cut off the block so that they can use all of it. But only the top and the bottom of the original block are smooth. So when you cut into it, it exposes these rough edges. And so in order to not be limited by just the smooth edges, you can cover those rough edges with Tyvek. And the diagram here is not my finest, but it's just meant to show you that you can cut into the side of ethafoam and then use, you know, like a micro spatula or a palette knife, just something flat, to stuff the Tyvek in there. It anchors the Tyvek without any adhesive, and it also allows you to get the Tyvek pretty nicely fit over the ethafoam. And if it doesn't seem like it's working, try just cutting, going a little bit deeper. Right, the angle finder. If you have to make a lot of bumpers for vases or baskets, that kind of shape, where you need the angle that the side makes with the horizontal. For me, I'm really bad at eyeballing that. It'll take me like 4 tries. So you can whip up one of these paper and Volara like little devices. It's just folder paper, like folder stock, and a little circle of Volara that I fished out of the hole punch. And it might seem silly, but if you have to make a lot of this style of support, you might come to appreciate it. You can just hold it right up to the object, get that angle, and then it'll hold it as you move it over to your foam. All right, so that was a lot about supports, which depending on where you are in your collections care saga, you know, may be more or less helpful to you. So I'm going to switch gears to some condition red flags. As you know, objects deteriorate in a lot of ways, and you know, we looked at all those different materials that objects could be made out of. And a lot of that deterioration happens before the object gets to your collection. So it's important to document conditions so that you can track it and see, like, is it happening here? Was it already like that? You just want to be able to have a record of that. And what I'd like to do in this section is talk a little bit about some warning signs that you might see in collections that suggest you may have an active condition issue. And it is definitely not an exhaustive list. So if you're not sure, I definitely recommend taking a photo and, you know, reaching out to a conservator. The American Institute for Conservation has a Find a Conservator search function on their website. That's the top link. And you can search by material type, by services, and you can also put in a zip code. If there's not any around you, there's also a box of like willing to travel, I think is what it says. If you are just looking for advice, then the geography doesn't maybe matter so much if you can just find somebody with the expertise you're looking for. But if you are hoping for someone to come and do a treatment, you can click that box. And that'll really open up your search results. So if you put in your zip code and it's like 0 conservators, don't despair. So I'm going to start with copper corrosion. There's a lot of different kinds of copper corrosion, and some of them are actually helpful. Like some of them create this protective, like non-reactive layer around the metal that stops it from corroding any further, which is very nice of it. Some are like patinas. They were intentionally added by the artist or manufacturer for, you know, aesthetic purposes or some other reason. But some corrosion is not so good. And a common place to see unwanted copper corrosion is in direct contact with leather. It's for all the same reasons that you want to handle metal collections with gloves, and that is that skin, which leather is also, has a lot of oils, salts, residues in general that react with the metal. And you might end up seeing this bright green corrosion product. Again, there's a whole range of colors for copper corrosion, especially in the blue and green spectrum. So don't panic if you're seeing blue and green, but definitely contact someone at that point. In the meanwhile, stabilizing the relative humidity will help slow down the process. And you can also try and reduce the contact area between the metal and the leather. In this case, you can see they're pretty well in contact with each other. But for something like a button, you might be able to get a mylar barrier behind it to just bring down that surface area, that contact area. And active corrosion can also be caused by polishing residues, and for archaeological collections, the burial environment. So there's a lot of different factors that go into this. And going back to the relative humidity for a second, something to be aware of with metals in general is that if you have high relative humidity, you can end up getting galvanic corrosion, which is when two metals are in contact with each other, one that's really noble, think like, I don't know, like platinum, and one that is not noble, so like zinc or iron. It's the same concept as zinking a boat for those of you who are seafaring. Basically, the less noble metal corrodes much faster when it's in contact, and that happens in the presence of water. And I read somewhere that it only takes like surface water of 3 molecules thick or something like that for that to happen, and so that can definitely happen with just like water in the air if your relative humidity is high. So that's when I was talking earlier about metals wanting that low relative humidity, that's part of that equation. If you start seeing fuzzy or chalky white crystals on materials that contain calcium carbonate, most commonly on shells, that's an indication that your environment is acidic. So the acidity could be coming from other collections. It could be coming from wood shelving or acidic storage materials. It's coming from somewhere, and a conservator, should be able to sort out the affected shells, but if you don't address the source of the acidity, the efflorescence will just pick right back up and continue when it's returned to that storage environment. So this is definitely a call to action on your environment. So I have 3 more conditions, and unfortunately these last 3 are all due to inherent vice, which just means something in the manufacturing that just makes them more prone to deterioration. So without going too much into the history and science of glass making, some glasses are formulated with more alkali than others, and that just brings down the melting point of the glass. It's an important part of the glass mixture, but if there's too much, then the alkali can leach from the glass when it's exposed to repeated relative humidity fluctuations. So glass disease starts as clouding. The glass gets cloudy. Sometimes it gets iridescent for a spell. Then you get these white crystals, as shown on the blue bead on the left. You might get the appearance of liquid droplets, which if you pH test those, they'll be very alkaline. It'll develop a crack network, like an internal crack network, sometimes called crizzling. And finally, the object will fall apart, which is what you're seeing on the right with this glass bead. So there's a lot of signs leading up to this, so don't ignore them. It is, like I said, it is inherent to the object, but it also, you can definitely act by stabilizing the relative humidity. This one will be familiar to anyone with historic film collections in the group, but cellulose nitrate was also used as an ivory and tortoiseshell substitute. So it shows up in combs, fans, little boxes, glasses, and just other historically ivory and tortoiseshell pieces. So if you have an object like this on the right that has that characteristic blocky internal cracking, you want to get that out of general storage. It will eventually break down, like the one on the left, but at this point it's already releasing nitric acid, and that will attack metals, papers, and other cellulose nitrate objects, including the object itself. So you'll want to isolate the degrading cellulose nitrate objects away from the rest of the collection, but you also don't want to seal them up because they're going to keep off-gassing, and sealing them in just lets them kind of like stew in their own juices and really speeds up the process. So their supports should also allow ventilation. As with most chemical reactions, bringing down the temperature and the relative humidity will help. It will slow down the process. So if you have cellulose nitrate in your collection, I would contact a conservator to get advice on cold storage, packaging options, both for going into cold storage or if cold storage isn't an option, what you can do in kind of as a second option, and also cellulose nitrate monitoring, because cellulose nitrate can go a long time and be fine, and then just something happens and it starts and then it just kind of goes for it. So monitoring is, you definitely want to know when that process starts. So lastly, there's some historic silks that are susceptible to embrittlement. And this has commonly been attributed to metallic salts used to weight the silk during manufacturing, like tin salts. But in looking into this more to prepare for this presentation, I found that it's maybe not totally clear. There's some discussion going on right now. It's a little bit up for debate. But cause and mechanism aside, the end result that we see is that shattering silk becomes very brittle. And sometimes the threads in one direction will preferentially deteriorate, so you end up with these parallel, unsupported, really brittle threads rather than a woven fabric. And as you can imagine, the remaining threads are really vulnerable. I don't know of any treatments at this time that address the chemical root of the problem, but textile conservators have come up with a lot of ways to provide physical support to protect the remaining silk. What you can do for these is reduce your ultraviolet radiation and your relative humidity, because the shattering and the embrittlement is accelerated by both ultraviolet and high RH. So that is my last kind of prepared slide. So hopefully I haven't put you guys off of objects too much and you feel empowered to build supports for your 3D collections and maybe have a better idea about when to reach out to a conservator. So we have some time, we actually have quite a lot of time for questions if anyone has any. And also, I should say, if you have a question but you don't want to ask it in this forum, I understand my email is on screen right now, so you can go ahead and shoot me an email. I am very much a generalist, which means I know a tiny bit about lots of things. So if it's a specific question, I probably can't answer it, but I should be able to point you in the right direction. Just for the folks who are dealing with taxidermy specimens, you might want to, if you haven't already, look into getting those, heavy metal tested, things like arsenic and mercury. If you're not sure in the meanwhile, probably handle those with gloves. And there are also specialists who deal specifically with taxidermy, conservators who deal specifically with taxidermy. So I would suggest, I'm going to write it down here. It's the Society of Preservation, oh my gosh, spinach, SP, Preservation of Natural History Collections, I think, fondly referred to as spinach, that might have some good information on your taxidermy specimens. Okay. For guns, okay. So I guess it depends on the gun. Really the only thing that I know about firearms is make sure that they're like decommissioned, that they can't go off. In some places there are regulations. I don't know about let me scroll up. Where are you? Well, let's see. Mississippi. I'm not sure, but I do know that some places, like if you're shipping that for an exhibition or something, that you need like special paperwork and stuff like that. Yes. It's probably metal, right? Mostly metal. So I think for the most part, from a material point of view, you can treat it like a metal. But yes, make sure that it's safe. Yes, you don't want explosives in your collection. Um, all right, Sarah. Yep. I'll keep an eye out for your email. So, Darlita, was your question about storage or maybe environment? Did you have a more specific part of about the gun? Yeah. Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I did have uh, an experience where, well, no, I didn't. I heard about it, I should say. It wasn't a personal experience, um, but about finding some shells that hadn't been decommissioned in the collection, and that was a surprise. How to store it? I've actually seen um, like gun storage cases, but if those are probably expensive. I've also seen them stored vertically, like with the butt down, and then the top held in place like with bungees that run across the case. If you just have the one gun, then maybe that's not as effective. Oh, and that's for rifles, by the way, that have the long barrel. So. Oh, yes. Ooh, sorry, I'm looking at the stringed instrument question right now. Um, yeah, I think if the environment is uncontrolled, then probably because you don't want those strings to snap. Um, I it is a tough one. I know that there are places where they want to keep their instruments in working condition, but the strings were designed to be tuned, so I think it should be fine. Even if you did want to be able to play it, you could just tighten them again after it's on exhibition. I don't know, Sarah, did that answer your question? I hope it answered. Yeah, I think that does sound like if it's the only thing like it in the collection, I would say probably a custom box would be a good plan. A very clearly labeled custom box. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. And yeah, shoot me an email if you have any questions that you think of later. Oh.